German Chancellor Angela Merkel has arrived in the White House for a key meeting with President Donald Trump. NATO, trade ties, Ukraine and of course Russia's behavior over there, they are sure to be discussed. The summit has been highly anticipated. In fact, it was supposed to take place early in the week on Tuesday, given that these two leaders have publicly differed on a broad range of issues. Mrs. Merkel has had a strong relationship with the former President Barack Obama. His final call, in fact, to a foreign leader as president was said to be to her, thanking her for her leadership. Now, on the other side of the world, American and German finance ministers say they are ready to cooperate in order to avoid a trade war. In their first joint meeting, they appeared to downplay the tension that is growing around the world, especially on trade issues ever since a new U.S. administration came into power. Both ministers said they would work together to sort out their respective differences with a common aim of promoting growth and prosperity. Now, that meeting came ahead of the G20 meeting in southern Germany, where top finance officials will be debating whether to confirm their rejection of trade barriers when they do meet.
Our focus is creating economic growth that is good for the United States and good for the rest of the world. And it is not our desire to get into trade wars. It is our desire to deal with where there is imbalance in certain trading relationships that we have a means to address that.
We had a very not only friendly but constructive and open discussion. We will deepen it further, but I think it was a good start. Of course, we both explained the situation and problems in our respective countries, but we both have the clear intention to work together with trust to have a positive influence on the continuing process of global governance.
All right, so let's dig deep into the policy details of what exactly will be discussed in a meeting between those two countries' respective leaders. Nathan King is live in Washington, D.C. tonight. He's got more data on this particular story. Nathan, these two leaders are so far apart on a broad range of issues. They might as well be in different galaxies: climate change, immigration, trade, how to deal with Russia. They have very differing positions on all of these. Is there anything they do agree on?
Well, they agree that they have to meet. And they agree that they're both powerful allies going back, since the end of World War II. Germany and the U.S. have linked Europe and the Americas since the end of the Second World War and throughout the Cold War, and German reunification. It's a very important relationship. There has been some progress since President Trump became the president, especially over NATO. During the meeting in Bonn, both the Vice President and the now Secretary of Defense basically reassured NATO that the President was committed to the alliance and said that people should step up and pay for a bit more. Germany has reminded the US that it is essentially at that 2% threshold of GDP spending on defense that NATO requires and the US requires, and others are following suit. So that's been put to bed. So the big thing is trade now. And as we saw just then with Stephen Mnuchin and his German counterpart, Germany does have a $50–60 billion trade surplus with the US. China has 500 to 600, and both those countries are in the crosshairs when it comes to this. The big suggestion here from the Trump White House is to have what they're calling a border adjustment tax, which essentially is a tariff. There is no coincidence that Angela Merkel has come here with CEOs from BMW, from Siemens and other companies, German companies that have investments in the US, to say, look how much we're putting into your economy. Do you really want to mess with that? So that is where the rubber is going to hit the road on these discussions. Whether we'll see any progress on them, we'll have to wait and see. But this is a real test case, not just for Germany, not just for China, but in terms of how the US deals with its close allies, previous allies, and whether Angela Merkel can also talk about the Moscow relationship and her experience with Vladimir Putin over the last decade or so.
Indeed. We'll get back to the trade surplus bit in just a moment. But given the president's habit of changing his mind on things, what are the specific policy outcomes that President Trump wants to get out of this meeting?
I think it's too early for that. I mean, they had a meeting about vocational training. Germany, as you know, is a world leader in vocational training apprenticeships, which then lead to full-time, good-paying jobs in their burgeoning manufacturing sector. That is something Trump has taken a big interest in, and that meeting is being well publicized. That's something they can agree on. But I think really it's a getting to know you session here. You know, Angela Merkel and Donald Trump will not want to rush into anything. They want to feel each other out. The personal relationships are very, very important. Also, remember, Angela Merkel is up for re-election in the next year or so, so she has a domestic audience to please far more than a foreign one. So let's look at her visit here through the domestic German politics lens as well.
Indeed. One last question for you, Nathan. Peter Navarro, Mr. Trump's trade advisor, he's been very, very critical of Germany and how the euro effectively enhances its export competitiveness. Yeah. But to what extent does that then automatically translate into a pretty aggressive, some would say hostile, US trade policy towards the EU?
Yeah, and Peter Navarro's had the same thing to say about China, hasn't he? Talking about currency manipulations, trade balances. Look, there's essentially a struggle going on here in Washington and in the White House between what's been called a group called the Economic Nationalists, which includes Peter Navarro, but he is by no means alone. Steve Bannon is part of that, the president's chief advisor. There are others too. And then the globalists, which are people like Cohn from Goldman Sachs, Steve Mnuchin and others, who see free trade as an important thing, and also going forward with a more globalist, with the US leading agenda, with some tweaks, of course. So that hasn't been played out yet. That's why we're all looking at this meeting between the US President Trump and Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, for any clues of which side is winning. There has been all sorts of rumors about the US perhaps bypassing the WTO. By putting up trade barriers. We just don't know yet exactly what's happening. But one thing is for certain, is that the Germans have come here to say, look, we are a German economy, but you must deal with the European Union as a whole. It's actually illegal for the US to negotiate trade deals with Germany because of the European Union. And I think that's a very underlying message too, as Angela Merkel says we're Germany, but also we represent Europe here too.
Indeed. It makes you wonder what Adam Smith would make of all the mercantilist rhetoric coming out of Washington these days. Thank you for that. That's Nathan Keane, of course, live in Washington, D.C.